want to talk about the future and future economic prospects in Africa. To do that, I want to start way in the past, because the difficulties that we have experienced economically in Africa and the possibilities have a lot to do with lessons that we can learn from the past trajectory that we have followed here and the people have followed elsewhere. So I'm going to start way in the past with this instrument here. It's the single instrument we have used, well, we, humankind, in total have used more than any other instrument. We use it for about 1 million years, from 1.2 million years ago until about 40,000 years ago in some places. This hand axe, in essentially the same design, was used over and over again. It is unquestionably the most downloaded app in the history of humankind. But it also tells you a different story. It tells you a story of long-run stagnation. It tells you for almost all of human history, we haven't just almost lived the same lives as our parents, but we lived practically identical lives from generation to generation for hundreds of thousands of years. So that's the first thing to realize, is the long-run history of humankind is the long-run history of stagnation. And that's going to change very dramatically. So this is 40,000 years ago. I'm going to turn the clock forward a little bit to 35,000 years ago. And now the story starts to look very different. These paintings here are taken from caves in Spain and France. They are not crude paintings. They are fantastic works of culture. What changed is sometime between 80,000 and 40,000 BC, language emerged in human society. And it may well have done so here in South Africa, at Stellenbosch on the southern coast. We don't know exactly where, but Stellenbosch is one of the potential sites. Once you have language emerge, a whole new kind of society is possible, and the fruits of culture that start to emerge that you see here. Now, we are not prosperous at this point in time, and that's the number that you'll see on the picture there. You'll see a number 1 next to the picture. That's a ratio. Please watch that number as I talk. That ratio is the ratio of the resources available to that society to the resources required for subsistence. So a ratio of 1 means you are just surviving. Now let's run the clocks. By the way, this is the middle of the last ice age, right? So this is a hard time. I'm going to move the clock forward to 24,000 BC, and our closest relatives, the Neanderthal, we say goodbye to them. They don't make it. They're ecologically unsuited to live through the ice age. They'd been around for 200,000 years, enormously successful group. The ice age, they had the wrong body type for the ice age. And we are still barely making it, right? You can see our ratio is still 1. We are barely hanging in there. In fact, right up to the end of the last ice age, our ratio is still only 1. In fact, you saw the race that Lee did earlier, right? It's living through that race as a species. Now, after the last ice age, things will start to change quite dramatically. And the first big change happens with what we call the agricultural revolution. So somewhere between 9,000 and 7,000 BC, in a number of different places across the planet, different societies started or settled down and started to domesticate plants and animals. And now you'll see the number change for the first time. Look at that number going up to 1.4. That means that society now has 40% more resources than is required for subsistence. And what do we do with the extra 40%? We start to build cities for the first time and living complexes. In the last 10 years, this complex in Turkey has been excavated. It's called Göbekli Tepe. It's twice as old as what we used to think was the oldest city in the world. It dates from between 9 and 8,000 BC. An extraordinarily ancient site with extraordinarily sophisticated architecture, which requires a society of some sophistication to be able to build, construct, and maintain this over hundreds and even thousands of years in the case of this particular site. So something very different is going on here. Now let's run the clock forward again to the next big change. So that's about 5,000 years after this. Now, you'll see how fast time goes in this talk of mine, by the way. Your experiences is the exact opposite from what my students normally experience in my lectures. So 5,000 years later is what we call the beginning of the Bronze Age. We call it the Bronze Age because it's associated with a big technological change in metallurgy. Crucially, we learn how to make bronze out of copper and tin, but not just that, we learn a lot of other metallurgy. And perhaps more importantly, this is when writing emerges, again in a number of different societies. Those societies who wrote on clay had the archaeological advantage that we could dig up their writing thousands of years later on. So this is a cuneiform tablet from Mesopotamia. It's a tablet about beer rations. Those Mesopotamians had their priorities right. And it's instructive that this is an accounting record. In fact, it's a peculiar fact of archaeology that so much of the earliest writing that we dig up is accountancy. That tells you something about what writing does. What does writing do? Is it allows you to cooperate with other people in an abstract way. So prior to writing, you can cooperate with people in your immediate circle, in your immediate social circle in a small society. Once you have writing, cooperation becomes possible with people you have never seen and will never see, even on the other side of the world. And all that's required for that is to keep a record of the actions and the commitments of both sides of the transaction. So accountancy is not just a recent invention, it's one of the oldest parts of organizing society. It also makes states possible. So you can get political integration once you have accounting records. And crucially, you can tax. Now we're going to run the story a little bit forward. So in this period, large empires will come and go. Persians, Greeks, Romans, we don't care about anything about that. Just look at the number there. It's still 1.6. It was, by the way, 1.6 at the start of the Bronze Age as well. So even though these empires have come and gone, the average person is no better off. 60% roughly off better than you need for subsistence in much of the world, but the average person is no better off. Of course, kings are better off. And if one king displaces another king, the new king is much better off. So it's not a story about elites, it's a story about the average person here. So elites have always been better off, but it's a story about the average person living much the same life in the year 400 AD as people did 1,000 years prior to that. And in fact, it will be much the same life in much of the world, even 1,000 years after this. There is also geographical variation. This painting is a depiction of the fall of Rome in the year 476, or the end of the Roman Empire in the year 476, and in the West at least. And this will start a period of about 500 years of really terrible stagnation in Western Europe. And the rest of the world wasn't necessarily experiencing that. India and China was doing much better. Parts of Africa was doing a lot better, especially on the East Coast, which is integrated into an Indian Ocean trade network of some sophistication. So you have to get a regional variation, but this is the average story. Now, the beginning of what we call the modern period is this acceleration in globalization that occurred from about the year 1500 onwards. Now, it's just the next round of globalization. We've had a global trade network right since that cuneiform tablet that I've shown you. Right since we were able to keep records, have we been trading over incredibly large distances. Now, much of that trading network for thousands of years was centered on the Indian Ocean basin, not the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean basin. And African traders were deeply integrated into that network. What's going to happen from the year 1500 onwards is that Europeans will start to enter this global trade network in a very big way and with new technology and, crucially, with a new organizational capacity. So the word organization is going to be important there, and the word cooperation. I've picked a picture not of ships, because the crucial point is not sailing. Other people could sail as well. The crucial point was a new capacity for cooperation. And the part of the picture that I want to emphasize is the clock tower on that church there. What you'll see there is a mechanical clock installed on the church on a market square in Nuremberg in Germany in around the year 1500. Mechanical clocks had been around for a couple of hundred years at this point in time, but they'd always been the private reserve of elites, of kings inside their palaces. What happened in Europe in about the year 1500 is that clocks were moved outside. So the time became public, so that we could all easily arrange to meet each other here this morning at a particular point. This cuts down the cost of cooperation absolutely dramatically. So these small steps that make cooperation more easy allow each of us to arrange the rest of our day more productively. And so that's going to be a big change. Now you'll see the effect of that on the wealth of Europeans already. So you see how the ratio has gone up to 2.8 now? So we started at 1, went up to 1.4, 1.6. Now we're at 2.8. That means 280% richer than you need for subsistence. So that's a big story. But the story is getting much better. In fact, the next step is the big step. This is the biggest single step in the history of in the history of economics. This is the Industrial Revolution. That's what the organizers of the Olympic Games thought of the Industrial Revolution in the opening ceremony. Economists are not particularly obsessed with the picture. We care about that number, the 9.3 you see at the side. What does that 9.3 tell you? It tells you that we have resources 900% more than we need for subsistence. This is the first time. So it's not just the number that's interesting to economists. It's the qualitative change that it represents. It's for the first time do we see a society emerge in which the average person rises above the level of subsistence. Elites have always been able to acquire extra surplus. For the first time, we now have a society that is able to generate sustained rise in prosperity for the average person. And at an unprecedented rate, because you'll see how this story has accelerated. I took literally thousands of years to move from 1 to 1.4, another thousands of years to 1.6, and then thousands of years to get to 2.8. And now in a 200-year window, I've gone from 2.8 to 9. So somehow economic history has accelerated in a dramatic way. Economics as a discipline emerges as an attempt to grapple intellectually with this question. And some of our biggest thinkers grappled with this in the 19th century. Marx is foremost amongst them, but he got the story wrong. Here's how he got the story wrong. He started with a very logical framework. The assumption that if you get more outputs, 9.3 versus 2.8, you must have used a lot more inputs. More land, more labor, more capital. That's why he called it capitalism. Now, we struggled with this for 150 years since Marx. And I think the biggest single discovery made by economics in the last 150 years is the conclusive demonstration from the data and from societies all around the world that the dramatic rise in welfare seen during the Industrial Revolution is not mainly due to more inputs. Of course, there were more inputs too, but it's mainly due to a more productive use of the inputs that there are. In other words, it's a rise in productivity. Now, how do we get this rise in productivity? Well, we get this rise in productivity by working differently. Not working harder, but working smarter. And how do you work smarter? Well, you know it in your own life. You work smarter when you specialize, when you become better at doing a few things instead of trying to do everything. But there's a catch. Once you swallow the blue pill of specialization, you become part of a society in which you absolutely need everybody else for almost everything else. So you give up the capacity for self-sustained life that you have in autarky when you take the step towards to greater productivity. Adam Smith saw this when he wrote in the last half of the 18th century. He said that the scope for specialization is limited by what he called the extent of the market. And what he means by the market there is the extent for cooperation. It's the extent to which we are able to cooperate that I am able to specialize in one aspect in the confidence that you will be able to satisfy all the other needs that I have in my life. So the scope for cooperation and the scope for specialization, those are the two central aspects of the Industrial Revolution. And let me show you how this worked in my own family's history. So this is one of the oldest photographs in this country. It's from about 1870. It's my great-great-grandparents. They farmed not far from here in Ceres. And in their case, they probably had wealth about 3.4 times the required level for subsistence. And I have a picture of their son and his wife, my great-grandparents, the next generation. Now, the first thing that you'll observe is how similar they look. They are living the same lives. In fact, they're living the same lives as their ancestors would have lived all the way since the Plessis came to the Western Cape in the late 17th century. Not identical lives. There were small changes in technology and organization. But the life of my great-great-grandfather in 1870 would have been very familiar to the life of his great-great-grandfather a century before that. It would not have been the same kind of psychological disconnect that we experience now when we look 3 or 4 generations into the past. How did this change? How did my family join the Industrial Revolution? Because up to this point, we are with all of human history. And then my grandmother, got on a train in Rustenburg in the year 1930. And she left Rustenburg for the University of Pretoria. And I had another grandfather who took a similar trip. And they literally drove out of all of human history and into the Industrial Revolution. By going to a university and starting that journey by which you learn to learn, by which you learn to work smarter, not harder. And that's a break that every family only has to do once. You never go back to the year 1870. Except if you don't make the trip. We have an interesting natural experiment in my family. My one grandfather is a Lithuanian immigrant. And he came to South Africa as a young boy. But some of his family stayed behind in rural Lithuania. So not in the cities, in rural Lithuania. And of course, then Lithuania was under communist occupation for much of the 20th century. And so my brother recently went back to see where our family lived. And he literally drove back into the 19th century. They are still there. My family's still there. But they're living in the 19th century. They never took the train out of the 19th century, which my father, by weird accident, was able to take, my grandfather, by being in South Africa. Now, my family was lucky, and people who live in Stellenbosch are lucky. We are preposterously wealthy. Here is modern-day Stellenbosch. Look at our ratio. 80-1. That's roughly the ratio in modern-day Stellenbosch. It's one of the wealthiest places on the planet. Now, not everybody in this country, and not everybody on our continent especially, has shared the same kind of good fortune that people did who live in Stellenbosch at this particular point. In fact, that's where I want to go next. So let's look at the history of recent economic history in Africa. This is the growth rate of the world in blue and of the African continent in aggregate during the 1980s. Now, let me tell you what the expectation of development economists were in the 1950s. The expectation was that Africa, with a lot of natural resources, would be an extraordinary economic development success after independence. The reality was stagnation. So this is the aggregate growth rate for these economies. If you add population growth, you'll see that these economies in per capita terms are stagnating or even shrinking. So this is a lost decade for Africa in the 1980s. And the 1990s, it's a bit better, but you'll see the green bar is still below the world. In other words, the poorest part of the world is falling further behind the rest of the world. We call this a divergence. The income distribution is pulling further and further apart. And poverty, which had been an Asian problem in the 1950s, by the late 1980s, poverty was largely an African problem. And we did this by falling behind. So why did we fall behind? I want to emphasize 5 reasons. You would have heard my chorus line about the logic of the Industrial Revolution. It's about becoming more productive, and you can only become more productive if you can cooperate. So that was the first problem, the enormously high cost of cooperation in Africa. Why was it difficult to cooperate? Well, we have some geographical trouble. But more importantly is we had a regrettable series of formal and informal barriers to cooperation. High tariff barriers, absurd regulations. Famously, for example, up to the 1990s, the Kenyan government required a new business in a particular industry to get written permission from the existing companies in the industry if they wanted to open up. We don't mind the competition. So that shuts down the possibility of dynamic competition in the industry. So lack of cooperation or very expensive cooperation was the first factor. The second is dysfunctional government. Now, governments are necessary to solve many important problems in a society, in a modern society, but they can also dysfunction. One of the unfortunate lessons of modern economics is that we can't find a recipe that will guarantee economic success based on a series of economic policies. In other words, we can't map out a sufficient package of policies that will guarantee economic prosperity. What we can do is with great confidence say that if you choose a bad set of economic policies, you will certainly suffer economic collapse. So there's an asymmetry in economic policy. Bad policy destroys growth. Good policy is at best a necessary but not a sufficient condition for growth. And we've seen too many bad governments in Africa in the post-independence era. Part of what I mean by a bad government is a government that institutes bad rules. So economists use the word rules for those formal and informal constraints on your behavior. So in England, for example, their informal agreement about how to queue is what we call an informal rule. A formal rule are all the laws on the books in the country and the way that they are policed and implemented. So there are formal and informal rules, And what do these rules do? Is they make it easy for us to cooperate because they make your behavior and my behavior predictable. And that lowers the cost of cooperation. We had the wrong rules in Africa. Most spectacularly recently, the undermining property rights in Zimbabwe was an example of choosing exactly the wrong set of rules if you wanted to join the Industrial Revolution. And there are high risks in Africa. That's the fourth reason. For geographic and ecological reasons, some of our societies are exposed to enormously high and asymmetric risks. They're also dependent sometimes on commodities, and these commodities expose them to price risks. But these risks go both ways. They also have upside risk. In the last decade, for example, we've experienced higher commodity prices, and so those same societies were able to get a windfall. But you don't get the windfall if you don't have the right rules. This is the story of our northerly neighbor, Botswana. So Botswana is the unsung hero of the history of economic development in the post-war period. From 1960 to the year 2000, it was the fastest growing economy in the world. And it shares the same risks as other sub-Saharan African countries. But what was different in Botswana was a good set of rules and a well-functioning government, which turned those same risks into the opportunities to become one of the world's most dynamic economies. And then the last point is conflict. There's no question that conflict destroys the capacity for cooperation and for those productively enhancing innovations. And we've had too much conflict in Africa, partly due to historical reasons, and partly due to the politics of the post-independence period. In the first 30 years post-independence, with the exception of Mauritius, there wasn't a single peaceful transition of government in post-independence Africa. From 1991 onwards, there were 30. So things are really changing. So let me get to what is changing. So this is the story of the last 10 years. See how much higher the green bar now is than the world. In fact, 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies in the last decade were African economies. So now the story looks very different. And they look different because we have lowered the barriers to cooperation. We've opened up economies. Governments have become much more competent, not uniformly so, but a lot more competent. And especially in certain localities. And what we are seeing is that those economies are doing better precisely where cooperation is made more accessible. We're also seeing a much better management of risks, a much better distribution of risks given the natural environment in Africa, and we're seeing a lot less conflict. The consequence of this rise in economic performance in Africa is that it's no longer possible for us to speak about the African economic experience. So here is a map in which I show you recent growth rates in Africa mapped onto the African map. The darker the color, the higher the growth rate of the economy. Don't bother to study the detail. The crucial point is the diversity that you see there. Some are doing very well, others are stagnating. It's no longer possible for us to simply make a statement like, well, African economic problems are, and enumerate a list. This was still possible 10 years ago. So we now have a continent with the single continent with the largest number of countries in the world, in which we are seeing very many different economic and governance experiments going on all the time. And the results are very encouraging. That those places where we are seeing the experiments that encourage cooperation and specialization, in those cases we do indeed see exactly the kind of prosperity that emerged elsewhere in the world when you try these things. So I think the future for Africa can be very bright. So if we turn the clock even further forward to the end of this century, so this is a very safe horizon for economists to be predicting on. The logic of the Industrial Revolution tells you that economies in Africa that open up to specialization and cooperation should be able to catch up to the rich economies by the end of the century. Now you might say that's too quick. Well, it's not too quick if you realize how the Industrial Revolution has itself sped up. I mean, I've shown you the numbers. They look like they were accelerated all the way to the 18th century. But they've accelerated much further since the 18th century. It took Britain 80 years. So Britain was the first country in the Industrial Revolution. It took them 80 years to raise, in inflation-adjusted terms, their income from $2,000 per head to $5,000. That means lower middle income to the kind of middle income where you never go back down. So they're well on the way to becoming rich. It took them 80 years to make that transition. It took Korea 15 years to do it in the post-war era. When China get to 5,000, it will have taken them less than 10 years. And the graph for all the countries in between them lies on a nearly linear downward slope. So the Industrial Revolution is giving us the capacity not just to become more prosperous, but to become more prosperous much faster than the first countries who did it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.